on the last episode of the Keepsake box. After the date, I didn't hear from David for 2 weeks. While I hadn't given it a second thought the first time, I was very bothered by his second disappearance. Now, if you've been paying attention, you realize that I had no real reason to be interested in David. The date was a dud, to say the least. From the beginning, I didn't feel that I belonged in that setting. I was aware that I was different. I looked different. I dressed differently. I behaved differently. Initially, that made me uncomfortable. David changed my name when he introduced me. I can only assume that his decision to do so was based on the fact that Shelonda sounded a little too ethnic for the legal group, and that made me uncomfortable. I spent more time talking to his friends than to him. That didn't make me uncomfortable, but I found it odd. I woke up in a strange house with the thought that I may have been drugged. That made me uncomfortable. David inappropriately joked about following me and going through my belongings. I considered the fact that he may have done so. That certainly made me uncomfortable. There were several things that occurred that made me uncomfortable, and justifiably so. So with all things considered, why was I so bothered that I hadn't heard from David? It boiled down to one simple thing: rejection. I hated the feeling of being rejected. And it wasn't just the feeling of rejection. It was also the understanding that I may have contributed to David's decision to no longer maintain contact. I thought about the situation quite a bit. Maybe my choice of attire was offsetting. Maybe I came across a little more ghetto than I thought. Maybe Shelly wasn't as accepted as I believed her to be. Maybe I didn't display the softness of Mandy and Tina. Maybe my inability to hold my liquor was problematic for David. I replayed each scenario and they all bothered me. I hated the feeling that I could have done something that would have created a more favorable outcome, and that has always been problematic for me. But 2 weeks later, David called. I answered the phone in the same manner as always. Hello? Again, David acted as if we had just encountered each other earlier in the day. Hi, it's David. Of course, I responded. Hi, David. It's Shelonda. David chuckled and continued the conversation. So, are you coming out to the bar on Friday? I was legitimately shocked and confused. I hadn't heard from David in 2 weeks. Yet, he addressed me as if we had a standing reserved date night. I paused momentarily to collect my thoughts. I told David that the last episode had led me to believe that drinking probably wasn't for me. He chuckled lightly. You'll be fine, he said. You just have to pace yourself. David told me that he would take it easier on me the next time, so I agreed to meet the legal group for drinks that Friday and many other Fridays thereafter. Chapter 6. Oh, the Proposition. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. Things went on that way for approximately 6 months. I met with David quite frequently, to the point that it was a bit of an expectation. We usually met with the legal group on Fridays. On other occasions, we met with other associates of his. Shelly was a hit. I was no longer concerned that I had failed to meet David's standards. I fit well into every group to which he exposed me, and I felt good about that. I was often bothered that I hadn't introduced David to anyone in my circle, but the truth is, I didn't have anyone. I hadn't spoken to my family in quite a while. And friends? I hadn't exactly lived a life that made it easy to keep friends around. So I fell into David's circle and made myself comfortable with them. Things went perfectly fine until David wanted to take things further, and that probably doesn't mean what you think. Although we were 6 months in, my situation with David was still very generic. It was actually quite stagnant. We talked and texted a few times throughout the week, but our situation certainly didn't require any depth. We hadn't had sex or even kissed. I didn't expect anything else from David, and he didn't seem to have a desire for anything more. On my end, the situation was just enough to keep my mind off of everything else. But for David, the 6-month period marked a point of change that I wouldn't ever have anticipated. It was Friday. my usual day with the legal group. As usual, 7:30 was our expected meeting time. At approximately 5 o'clock, my phone rang. I answered. Hello? David addressed me as he always did. Hi, it's David. I returned his greeting as I always did. Hi, David, it's Shelly. David chuckled as he did every other time. Seemingly, that would have gotten old by the 6-month period, yet it hadn't. David got right down to the intended purpose of the call. I was thinking, he said, what do you think about changing things up tonight? I jokingly asked if he wanted to have margaritas opposed to our normal martinis. David chuckled and responded, we're certainly overdue for a change, in drinks and in life. David went on to say that he wanted the two of us to go out to dinner alone. That was indeed a change. For 6 months, I had gotten into my car, driven to one bar or another, and met with the same groups of people. David and I hadn't ever been on a proper date, and he hadn't ever expressed a desire for us to do so. It seemed as if David and I were just good friends. I was perfectly fine with the way things were, and I assumed that we were just letting things run their course. I had no desire to force anything. Those were my feelings prior to that point. But after David requested a one-on-one date, I wondered if he had the desire to change the dynamics of our relationship. Even though I was comfortable with the way things were, I realized that I wasn't opposed to elevating the situation. I was a little excited about the prospect of something deeper. I agreed to David's request. He advised me that he would be at my house at 7 o'clock, putting us on track to be at the restaurant by 7:30. We ended the call, and I proceeded to get ready for our date. I felt that I should be a little extra for my first one-on-one date with David. I wore a form-fitting red dress and paired it with gold pumps and a gold clutch. I also wore gold accessories, of course. I looked in the mirror and felt that I looked good. I felt good. David arrived at exactly 6:55. I was grateful that I had gotten dressed a little early. I was known to run late on a regular basis, as you know. I opened the door to find that David was holding a bouquet of flowers. They were purple orchids, my favorite. It was an unexpected gesture, to which I was grateful. I accepted the flowers and invited him in to have a seat. I put the flowers in water and went into my bedroom to retrieve my shoes. As I exited, I saw that David was checking his watch. I grabbed my purse and told him that I was ready. David smiled stiffly and opened the door. We exited. As we approached the car, David walked ahead and opened the door for me. He then walked around and entered the driver's side. David started the engine and glanced over to me. He smiled. It was a tight, apprehensive smile. You look pretty, he said. I thanked him and assumed that we would be on our way. But there was more to be said. That was the first time that I was exposed to something that I would come to be very cognizant of, David's time complex. Still facing my direction, David addressed me. He said, I need you to understand something, Shelly. I am a stickler for being on time. I believe that time is money, and I intend to stay rich. That's nice to know, I said. David again displayed the same stiff smile. Keep that in mind, he said. While I had initially thought that David was just supplying superfluous information, the conversation seemed to take on a more accusatory tone. I started to feel that he was accusing me of hindering the process of us being on time. I looked at the clock in David's car. Maybe I had pegged the situation incorrectly. It was 7:03. We had probably gotten into the car at exactly 7 o'clock. Surely he wasn't bothered by the timeline. I dismissed it. I found that I can be overly analytical. I decided that it must have been one of those instances. It had to be. We talked on the way to the restaurant. It was very generic. David told me about his day at work and how he had struggled through leg day at the gym. The conversation didn't hold my attention. It simply wasn't interesting. However, I listened, happy that I was finally learning a little more about him. We arrived at the restaurant and I reached for the door handle. David lightly touched my leg and I glanced over to him. Let me get that, he said. His tone was firm and reassuring. The encounter reminded me of my Saturday dates with Ron. I quickly dismissed the thoughts. Ron was the last person I wanted to think about in that moment. David walked around and opened my door. I exited the car. He extended his bent elbow, the universal request to interlock arms. I complied. We walked into the restaurant, and David addressed the hostess. Reservation for Herkowitz? Hearing David's last name was jarring to me. Up to that point, I had been able to compartmentalize. For months, David was simply David. He was an occasional conversation on the phone. He was a member of the Friday legal group. He was the reason why I was often a +1. But hearing his last name aloud registered a different affiliation. Antonio. Antonio called him Mr. Herkowitz. I couldn't believe that I had been able to push that aside until that point in time. I experienced a sinking feeling in my stomach that I forced myself to dismiss. Things were stabling out for me. I couldn't afford to go back to that place. As I snapped out of my thoughts, I realized that the hostess was assessing me. She seemed to be surprised that I was David's choice of company. After giving me the up and down, the hostess pretty much disregarded my existence. She turned her attention to David. She smiled and addressed him. "It's nice to see you again, Mr. Herkowitz. Will you be requiring special seating arrangements?" I was very bothered by her dismissive behavior towards me, yet I said nothing. I didn't want to appear to be too harsh or too sensitive. I thought it best to ignore the situation. Little did I know that one of David's lines had been crossed. That was the first time that I was exposed to David's reaction to disrespect. He made sure that everyone knew their place. It was reminiscent of my times with Antonio, and I loved the way he handled the situation. David smiled and addressed the hostess in what I now know to be his way. David said, "This is Shelley. She is my date. From this point forward, all arrangements will be handled through her. You can ask her where she'd like to sit. And could you hurry, please? She doesn't like to eat after 8. I could tell that the hostess was embarrassed, and even though she was less than courteous towards me, I felt a little sorry for her. Nonetheless, she turned to me and requested that I follow her. She led us to a private area near the rear of the restaurant. I picked a table next to the window as the outside scenery was beautiful. David pulled out my chair and I took a seat. He took his own seat and addressed me. "Sweetheart, will you tell our hostess that I would like a glass of water, please? No lemon." I addressed the hostess. "We'll have 2 glasses of water, one with lemon, one without." I could tell that the hostess was uncomfortable, but she nodded her head and responded, "Yes, ma'am." She passed a menu over to me and attempted to pass one to David. After realizing that he was refusing to acknowledge her, the hostess placed David's menu on the table in front of me. In typical David fashion, he complicated the situation. He addressed me. "Sweetheart, will you advise our hostess that you would prefer to receive the menu directly in your hand?" Before I was able to address her, the hostess apologized and re-offered the menu. I accepted it and she went on her way. I expected a conversation about what had transpired, but David said one thing only: "Disrespect will not be tolerated. Nothing more, nothing less." David's behavior made me a little uncomfortable, but a part of me was intrigued. I felt that he exhibited a mix of the powerful part of Angel and the protective part of Antonio, and I liked that. We reviewed the menu. David told me that he wanted the salmon and asparagus. When the hostess returned, I relayed David's order and requested a seafood pasta dish for myself. David started talking to me while the hostess was standing there, ensuring that we were both dismissive towards her. "Do you know how many calories are in that?" he said. I responded, "Gotta go sometimes, right?" I laughed. He laughed as well. Looking awkward, the hostess took our menus and walked away. We participated in idle chatter until she returned with our orders. I pushed my food around with the fork, hoping that the hostess hadn't decided to pay us back with her spit. We started to consume our meals. I expected more random conversation about some case that David was working, or maybe even his gym experience. However, the conversation took a turn that I never expected. I want to warn you that you may want to skip over this portion of the story if you're easily triggered. It'll make you angry. It should have made me angry, or at the very least bothered. Yet, it really didn't. Well, it did, but not nearly as much as it should have. David addressed me in the manner that one would conduct a business deal, or maybe an interview. It went a little something like this. Shelly, I have to admit that I have a very specific reason for bringing you here. I like you, and I'm under the impression that you like me as well. I'm getting older, and I'm ready to settle down. I'm looking for some very specific things in life, one of which is a relationship. Now, I'm sure you know that I'm very influential around here, and I'm not going to pick just any woman. I require some very specific things, and I think you could be everything that I'm looking for. That being said, I would like to offer you a proposition, but first, I'd like for you to consider some things. I want you to think about where we were last week and where we are tonight. Think of where you live and where I live, what you drive and what I drive. There's one little thing that can close that gap. Do you know what that is, Shelly? I looked at David, ensuring that the irritation was properly displayed on my face. No, I said, but I'm sure you're audacious enough to tell me. David continued, as if I hadn't returned his insult. That one thing, sweetheart, is cooperation. I didn't like his tone or any insinuations that he may have been making. Of course, I was sure to advise him of that fact. Even so, he continued. He said, I would like the opportunity to upgrade your life. I will upgrade your appearance, wardrobe, housing, and transportation. You like this place, Shelly? I will take you to any fancy restaurant, on any vacation, and to all of the extravagant parties. I will introduce you to everyone who is anyone and put you in a position to be one of the most powerful women in the city. It will just require some cooperation on your end. I continued to display my hard exterior, but I was intrigued. What does cooperation entail? I asked. David smiled and continued. I'm glad you asked. I'm prepared to do all the things I mentioned, but here's what I need for you. In this order. 1, you must agree to enter into a pre-relationship with me. You will allow me to court you exclusively for the purpose of exposing you to the life that I can provide for you. You will not date anyone else. You will attend dinners and functions with me, and you will look the part. If that goes well, you will be required to go back to school. I will pay for a program of your choosing so long as it meets my standards. Additionally, I would like for you to lose some weight. Not much, maybe 10 to 15 pounds. If these conditions are completely met to my satisfaction, it will be decided upon that we will become an official couple. I was shocked. You are horribly audacious, I said. David laughed and explained it in his way. Shelly, I don't mean to insult you, but I want you to understand something. Many relationships are like business arrangements. Both parties have to offer something that's beneficial to the partnership. We're off to a good start, and I have no doubt that we can grow to love each other. I will make myself available to you for that purpose. I've told you that time is money, so if I'm investing my time, understand that I believe you to be worth it. Now, as for my demands, let's be honest. Given the opportunity, would you not do those things for yourself? Would you not benefit from having done so? Do you not feel that you're deserving of the best? Understand this, Shelly. I am the best. I am confident in that fact. I am also confident in the fact that you deserve me. Do you not agree? David paused and awaited my response. I sat quietly. That was one of the few moments in which I was at a loss for words. I wasn't sure if I was being complimented or insulted. It was really hard to tell. I quietly waited for David to continue, and he did. He said, I know this is a lot to take in, and maybe it's a bit much to expect an answer tonight. Let's do this. Take some time to think things over, and we'll revisit the subject at a later date. Depending on your decision, you can either meet me at the bar on Friday, or I will arrive at your house to take you on an outing that is representative of someone who deserves the best. The choice is yours. Either way, I expect you to be on time. I nodded my head to signal that I would think about it, and David exited the conversation as if we hadn't ever discussed anything at all. "Let's get to know each other," he said. Neither he nor I mentioned the proposition again that night. David and I finished our dinner and he drove me home. On the way, a familiar song started playing on the radio. It was "Where Do Broken Hearts Go" by Whitney Houston. I experienced a range of emotions. While that was my favorite song, there was so much sadness attached to it. Even still, I couldn't resist the urge to turn up the volume and sing at the tops of my lungs. I glanced over to David. I couldn't read his face. He looked confused, maybe even a little bothered. "I'm sorry," I said. "This is my favorite song." David displayed a stiff smile before addressing me. "Wouldn't it still be your favorite song if you played it a little more quietly?" I laughed and continued to sing. David didn't laugh. I returned the radio to its previous volume once the song was over. When we arrived at my house, David walked me to the door and kissed me on my cheek. He said, "Have a good night, sweetheart." He walked away, and that was that. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's one arrogant jerk, right? Of course I saw that part of him. There wasn't any way around that. But in typical Shelonda fashion, I spent days weighing it all out. However arrogant, I saw the benefits of dealing with David. Not many people would admit this, but I wanted everything that David was offering. I wanted my own personal advancement, and I also liked how I looked with David. I liked the way people treated me when I was with him. I liked the fact that he demanded respect for me, and I wanted that. I felt that I deserved it. What was the worst case scenario? The situation didn't go as planned? That could happen in any relationship, right? Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.